Shiloh. Before Jerusalem became the religious capital of Israel, Shiloh was the main center for worship. The tabernacle was the scene of religious festivals and sacrifices. It was also where Eli trained Samuel. Archaeological ruins are all that remain there today. Priest's breastplate. As high priest of Shiloh, Eli wore a bejeweled breastplate. This woven square was encrusted with 12 gemstones: ruby, topaz, beryl, turquoise, sapphire, emerald, jacinth, agate, amethyst, chrysolite, onyx, and jasper. Each was inscribed with the name of a tribe of Israel. Samuel is called to serve God. Elkanah had 2 wives, Peninnah and Hannah. Each year they all went to Shiloh to make a sacrifice and to worship in the tabernacle with its great pillars. Hannah prays to the Lord for a son. Hannah was beautiful, the apple of her husband's eye, although she had not given him any children. She sat by his side at the feast, and he gave her all the choicest meats. Peninnah watched, green with envy. She had given her husband children, so why was she not his favorite? She went to Hannah, taunting her cruelly. "You'll never have a baby, will you? What kind of wife are you?" Hannah was reduced to tears. She fled to the tabernacle where Eli, the high priest, was sitting on a chair. He watched her. "O Lord, remember me," she prayed. "Please give me a son. I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and his life will be dedicated to you." She was in such a state that Eli got up from his chair and went to her. He asked her if she was drunk. "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord." Eli smiled at her and said, "Go in peace. May the God of Israel grant you what you have asked him." Before long, Hannah discovered that her prayer had been answered and she was going to have a baby. In time, she gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, which means asked of the Lord. The time came for Hannah to take Samuel to Shiloh. When they got there, she approached Eli in the tabernacle. "I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. Do you remember? I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him," she said. "So now I give him to the Lord. His whole life shall be dedicated to the Lord." Hannah kissed her son goodbye and handed him to Eli. From that day on, Samuel helped the high priest with his duties. Samuel wore a special linen tunic with an embroidered belt just like the other priests. Each year, when Hannah came back with her husband to Shiloh, she brought a coat she had made for Samuel to wear. And Eli blessed her, saying, "May the Lord give you children to take the place of the one you prayed for and gave to the Lord." And the Lord blessed Hannah with more children. Samuel respected the Lord and worked hard, helping Eli as he grew older. But Eli's own sons, who were priests, were dishonest and stole offerings that were meant for the altar. Their father begged them to mend their ways, but they took no notice. One day, Eli had a visitor with a message from God. "I choose your ancestors out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priests. Why do you honor your sons more than me? Why do you allow them to grow fat on offerings that belong to me? They have brought shame and disgrace on the name of the Lord." Eli listened but did nothing. In the middle of the night, Samuel heard his name being called. He ran to Eli, who said, "I didn't call you. Go back to sleep." Samuel jumped back into bed and was just drifting off to sleep when he heard the voice again. "Samuel, Samuel," it called. He ran back to Eli, who said, "You must be dreaming. Go back to bed, my child." Obediently, Samuel did as he was told and had just fallen into a deep sleep when he heard the mysterious voice again, calling, "Samuel, Samuel." Frightened, he ran to Eli again. The old man sat up and knew that it must be the Lord. He told Samuel to listen to the voice if he heard it again. Samuel obeyed, and when he heard his name being called again, he said, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. You must tell Eli that he and his bloodline are doomed. His sons are sinful, and he failed to stop them." The next morning, Samuel told Eli what God had said. Eli replied sadly, "He is the Lord. He knows best." And as Samuel grew to manhood, the Lord was with him, and all the tribes of Israel knew that he was the prophet of the Lord. His whole life shall be dedicated to the Lord. Understanding the story. Like Sarah, Rebekah, and Samson's mother, Hannah's infertility is resolved by God. All 4 women hope for a child, and eventually their wishes come true. Each of their children has been chosen by God for a special purpose on earth. Hannah's son Samuel is the first great prophet after Moses. Like all prophets, Samuel's role is to proclaim God's word and guide people towards righteousness. The ark is captured. The Philistines and the Israelites fought a battle on the plain of Sharon. At least 4,000 Israelites died, and the survivors asked, "Why did the Lord bring defeat upon us today at the hands of the Philistines?" "They have sent us the ark of the God of Israel to kill us. Iron weaponry. The Philistine armies were very organized and fierce. Their ironworking skills also gave them a great advantage in war. Harder than bronze and easy to find, iron was suited to weaponry. The use of iron daggers, above, and swords dealt a tough blow to the Israelites on the battlefield. Over time, the Israelites also worked out how to use iron. That night, the elders talked together, knowing that the Lord had deserted them. They decided, as a last resort, to bring the Ark of the Covenant from the tabernacle in Shiloh. They believed it would save them from their enemies. They sent a messenger to Shiloh, and, before long, the golden ark arrived in their camp. It was brought by the highest priest's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and was a magnificent sight. The soldiers stared in amazement, and a great cheer filled the air. The ground shook. The Philistines heard the cheer from the other side of the plain, and they wondered what was going on. When they found out that the Israelites had the famous Ark of the Covenant by their side, they were filled with terror. "A god has come into their camp," they said. "We must attack." They advanced on the Israelites again, and a battle was fought at Ebenezer. The slaughter was terrible, and the ark did not help the Israelites. 30,000 of them died on the battlefield, including Hophni and Phinehas. The ark was captured by the Philistines. Eli, the high priest, who was 98 years old, was saddened by the news of his sons. But when he was told that the ark had been captured, he fell off his chair and broke his neck. And so the Israelites lost the high priest as well as the ark. The Philistines took the ark to the town of Ashdod and put it in the temple beside their great god Dagon. In the morning, when they went there to pray, they saw with horror that the statue of Dagon had fallen to the ground in front of the ark. Dagon's head and hands lay smashed on the threshold of the temple. The Lord then sent a plague of boils and a plague of rats to torment the people of Ashdod. These brought terrible disease and death. The Philistines knew that it was all the fault of the ark. "What shall we do with it?" they asked each other. They persuaded the neighboring town of Gath to give the ark a home. As soon as it arrived there, plague and pestilence hit the town, and the people could not wait to get rid of the ark. They sent it on to Ekron, but as it was carried through the town, the people shouted, "They have sent us the ark of the God of Israel to kill us." The Philistine lords called an emergency meeting. The ark had been with them for 7 months now and had brought nothing but death and destruction. "How can we send the terrible thing back?" they asked each other. The lords conferred, then told the people, "Do not send it back empty. Send a guilt offering to the God of Israel. That will do the trick." They told the people to make 5 gold boils and 5 gold rats, and put them in a chest beside the ark on a cart pulled by 2 cows. If the cart went of its own accord toward Beth Shemesh, where the tribe of Dan lived, then the Lord of Israel had brought the plagues. If it went the other way, the plagues had happened by chance. Before long, a cart carrying the ark and a chest of gold boils and gold rats set off. The cows headed straight for Beth Shemesh. The Israelites could not believe their eyes when they saw the cart. It stopped right by them, and they placed the ark on a rock, with the chest containing the gold boils and gold rats by its side. They sacrificed the 2 cows as offerings to the Lord. From there, the Ark of the Covenant was taken to Kirjath Jearim in Judah, which was to become its home for the next 20 years. A shrine was made for it, and a man called Eliezer from the tribe of Levi was consecrated to guard it. Model of the Ark. Featuring a pair of cherubim extending their wings in protection, this model's design is based on the description of Israel's holiest object in the Bible. The Ark contained God's 10 commandments. Understanding the story. The Ark of the Covenant symbolizes God's eternal presence and power. The Israelites assumed the Ark will deliver victory against the Philistines, but instead they suffer bloody defeat. The Philistines treat the Ark as a captured idol, but the belief that their gods are more powerful than the God of Israel is short-lived. God shows both nations that he cannot be manipulated, and the fate of their countries is in his hands. Ephraim countryside. Ephraim, meaning fruitful, was a mountainous but fertile area. Saul was looking for the lost donkeys in the nearby hills. This region was familiar to Saul because it was where he was born and raised. Ephraim was also the name of Joseph's second son, whose descendants became one of Israel's largest tribes. Pharaoh Susennas. When the Israelites were demanding their own king, Pharaoh Susennas I, circa 1039 to 993 BCE, was on the Egyptian throne. He brought stability to Egypt, restoring peace after a civil war and carrying out temple reconstruction. His power was absolute. Saul, king of the Israelites. Times were hard for the tribes of Israel, and they quarreled with each other all the time. There was discontent and powerful enemies on every side. The elders gathered and came to their prophet Samuel at his home in Ramah. "You are getting old, and we do not think that your sons can carry on in your footsteps," they said. "We need a king, not a prophet, to lead us." Samuel did not like the idea of a king at all, and he prayed to the Lord. "Listen to them," replied the Lord. "It is not you they have rejected, but me, just as they have rejected me from the moment that I brought them out of Egypt. They have forsaken me and worshipped other gods, but warn them what kings are like." Samuel repeated God's words to the elders, but they took no notice. "We want to be like other nations, with a king to lead us and fight our battles." The Lord told Samuel to do as the people asked. He said that he had chosen a young man named Saul from the tribe of Benjamin to be the first king of Israel. "I have decided to give my people a king. Anoint Saul as leader of all my people. He will deliver them from the hands of the Philistines." The next day was much like any other for Saul. He had no idea what was in store. Some of his father's donkeys had gone missing, and he was searching for them in the hills. When he came to the town of Zuph and heard that a seer had just arrived to bless the sacrifice, his ears pricked up. He thought that the seer might be able to use his special powers to help him find the donkeys. As Saul went into the town, he saw an old man walking slowly up the hill. He asked him where he could find the seer. The man replied, "I am the seer." And as if he could read Saul's mind, he went on, "Do not worry about your donkeys. They have been found. Come with me to the holy place where I am going to bless the sacrifice. You have been chosen to be the first king of Israel." Saul listened in amazement. "But I am a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel, and my clan is the smallest clan of the tribe of Benjamin. Why me?" Saul smiled but did not answer the question. He just led him up to the holy place at the top of the hill. After the sacrifice had been made, there was a splendid feast. Saul sat in the place of honor at the head of the table and was given a special piece of meat by Samuel that had been set aside for the prophet himself. The next day Samuel took a large horn that was filled with oil, perfumed with spices and myrrh. He poured it slowly over Saul's head, saying, "The Lord has anointed you king of Israel, leader of all his people." And then he went on, "Now you must go home. You will meet 2 men who will tell you that your donkeys are found, but that your father is worrying about you. Then, by the great tree at Tabor, you will see 3 men with 3 goats, 3 loaves of bread, and a skin of wine. They will give you 2 of the loaves. Then you will go on and meet some prophets, chanting to the sound of lyres, tambourines, flutes, and harps. Join them, and you too will prophesy. The Spirit of God will come upon you." Samuel said goodbye to Saul and blessed him, telling him that he would meet him in 7 days' time. Saul went on his way, and, sure enough, all the things that Samuel had predicted came true. Samuel summoned all the people to Mizpah to make the great announcement that a king had been chosen. But as they assembled in their thousands, Saul was nowhere to be seen. Eventually he was found hiding behind some bags, pale with fear and apprehension. Reluctantly he came out and stood by Samuel, head and shoulders above the rest of the crowd. "This is your king," the prophet declared. "He has been chosen by the Lord." Everybody cheered and shouted, "Long live the king!" But some people looked doubtful and shook their heads. Then Samuel explained the rules of kingship and wrote them down on a scroll that he dedicated to the Lord. People had come from all over the country to see their new king, to swear allegiance, and to bring him gifts. But some of the Israelites were not happy with their new king. "How can he save us? We've never even heard of him," they hissed, "and he's a Benjamite of all things. He was so frightened he went and hid when he was proclaimed king." Samuel anoints Saul as leader of all God's people with special oil from a horn. Understanding the story. When Samuel anoints Saul with oil, the process represents his consecration to God. He is now blessed to be the king. The Israelites have a leader to unify their tribes and save them from their enemies. But the people and the land still ultimately belong to God. Israel's king differs from those of other countries because Saul is ruling only as God's representative on earth. Saul's downfall. Soon after Saul had been proclaimed king, the Ammonites besieged the great walled town of Jabesh, a few miles east of the Jordan River in Gilead. The Lord has chosen someone else now and will make him leader of his people. Nahash threatens the Jews at Jabesh from the Psalter of St. Louis, created for the French king Louis IX, 1214 to 1270. It was a rich and fertile part of the world, and Nahash, the Ammonite king, wanted to drive the Israelites from their stronghold. He surrounded the walls with his troops. For weeks, nothing could get in or out of the town, and the food began to run out. The people were starving, and their thoughts turned to surrender. Eventually, they sent messengers down to Nahash saying that they would make a treaty. But Nahash replied, "I will only make a treaty with you on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every single man in the town." When the elders of Jabesh received this ghastly message, they asked for 7 days' grace. Then, at dead of night, they sent messengers out of the city to tell their kinsmen of their plight. When the news reached Gibeah, where Saul lived, he was just coming back from the fields with his oxen. Saul listened in horror and, burning with rage, snatched the messenger's gleaming sword and plunged it deep into the oxen. He sent the scraps of meat like bleeding messages all over the country, calling the Israelites to arms. In response, the tribes of Israel flocked to Saul's side, but it took more than 5 days for them all to arrive, and only 1 day was left before every man in Jabesh would lose an eye. Saul sent word to the besieged city that help was on its way. When they received the message, the people of Jabesh told the Ammonites that they would surrender the next day. Meanwhile, Saul divided his men into 3 companies and headed toward Jabesh. Then, at dead of night, they surrounded the Ammonite camp. At daybreak, the Israelites sounded their trumpets and swept in. The Ammonites, sleepy and unprepared, were swiftly defeated. But despite this triumph over the Ammonites, Saul was king of the Israelites in name only. For years the tribes of Israel had been under the thumb of the rich and powerful Philistines. Saul longed to free his people, but his army was small and his weapons were few compared to the might of the enemy. His son Jonathan was one of his most important lieutenants. He was stationed at Gibeah, near a small Philistine outpost that caused him nothing but trouble. One day, infuriated by the insults of the officer in charge of the enemy outpost, Jonathan attacked it, killing all of the Philistine soldiers there. News of the bloodshed soon spread, and before long the entire Philistine army was being mobilized against the Israelites. Saul waited at Gilgal with his men, quaking at his side. But he could not give the order to join the battle before a sacred offering had been made to the Lord. The prophet Samuel had said that he would be there within a week to make the blessing. As the days went by and the tension rose, some of Saul's men fled in fear. Finally, on the 7th day, unable to wait any longer, Saul made the offering himself. And just as he finished, Samuel arrived and said, "What have you done?" "You have not arrived when you said you would, and my men are deserting me," Saul replied. Samuel looked him straight in the eye and said, "You have not obeyed the Lord. If you had, your kingdom would have lasted forever. The Lord has chosen someone else now and will make him leader of his people." With that, the prophet turned around and left. Saul watched him go, aghast as the full meaning of his words sank in. Gibeah. During Saul's reign, Gibeah, the word is similar to the Hebrew word for hill, was his hometown and the capital city of Israel. Gibeah is now identified as Tel Eful. This hill is located on the central Benjamin Plateau, which lies 3 miles or 4.8 kilometers north of Jerusalem. Animal sacrifice altar. In ancient times, animal sacrifice was a common ritual throughout the Middle East. The Canaanites crafted rectangular or oval altars from uncut field stones. This is an example of an oval altar. Most altars were constructed on high places, such as hilltops. Understanding the story. Saul acts in haste because his army is disappearing as the Philistines grow stronger. Though Saul was king, he was really working under Samuel's leadership because God spoke via his prophets. Impatience makes Saul ignore Samuel's command, which proves his lack of faith in God. In addition, the law of Moses states that only a priest can make offerings. So again, Saul's behavior is disobedient. As a result, God chooses a new leader. God chooses David. Saul reigned over the Israelites for more than 40 years. But because he did not always obey God's commands, God decided to choose a new king for his people. I will tell you which one to anoint. Star of David. The Star of David, or Shield of David, is the symbol of Israel. In 1948, it was officially adopted for the modern state flag. Though its origins do not relate directly to David, his historic importance resulted in the star being named after him. The star has been seen on tombs of the 3rd century CE, but its first mention was not until the 12th century in a Jewish text. The prophet Samuel remembered the day long ago when he had anointed the young Saul as king. He had not seen him for many years now and was saddened. God said to him, "How long will you mourn for Saul? You know I have rejected him as king of Israel. Fill your horn with oil and be on your way. I am sending you to find a farmer named Jesse in Bethlehem. I have chosen one of his sons to be king." He told Samuel to take a heifer with him and to invite Jesse and his sons to the sacrifice. "I will show you what to do," he said. "I will tell you which one to anoint." So Samuel traveled to Bethlehem in Judah. When he arrived, the elders greeted him in awe. They did not know why the great prophet had come to their village. "Do you come in peace?" they asked, bowing down before him. "Yes, I have indeed come in peace," Samuel replied. "I have come to make a sacrifice to the Lord." They took him to find Jesse, who was a descendant of Boaz and Ruth. Samuel asked Jesse to call his sons together. The humble farmer was amazed, not knowing why he and his sons had been singled out. Samuel invited them all to the sacrifice, but first he consecrated them to God. One by one, the young men stepped forward. The first, who was named Eliab, was tall and handsome, and Samuel thought that he must be the one whom God had chosen. But God said, "Do not consider his appearance or his height. This is not the one. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Jesse called his next son, who was named Abinadab, to step forward. He was also a fine young man. But Samuel said, "The Lord has not chosen this one either." Then it was the turn of the third son, named Shammah, but he was not the one, and Samuel shook his head. All 7 of Jesse's sons came to Samuel in turn, but none of them were chosen. The great prophet was puzzled and said to Jesse, "Are these really all the sons you have?" "There is another one," replied Jesse. "He is the youngest, still a child really. He is named David, and he is out in the fields looking after the sheep." Samuel asked him to send for his last and youngest son immediately. He waited calmly, holding the horn of holy oil in his hand. In a little while the door burst open and a young boy ran in. He was a fine-looking child with ruddy cheeks and blue eyes. Samuel looked at him and heard the voice within him saying, "This is the one I have chosen. Anoint him." So Samuel poured the perfumed oil over David's young head and anointed him in front of his father and his 7 brothers. They watched in silence, hardly able to believe their eyes, and from that day on the Spirit of the Lord was with David wherever he went and whatever he did. Samuel anoints David, 2nd century CE tempera on plaster from the National Museum of Damascus, Syria. Understanding the story, God decides David will be Saul's replacement as king of Israel. Though a young shepherd may seem too inexperienced to be the country's ruler, God knows David has the necessary qualities. David cares for his sheep by feeding them, guiding them, and protecting them from danger. This is exactly what God wants for his people. Valley of Elah. The scenic spot in Judea was also a battlefield. The Philistines and Israelites assembled their armies on facing hills either side of the narrow valley of Elah and prepared to do battle. The valley takes its name from the type of trees that grow in nearby woodland. David and Goliath. The Philistines and the Israelites drew up their battle lines above the valley of Elah in Judah and faced each other from the peaks of their separate hills. Sling. Though the sling was a deadly weapon of war, the shepherd David would have used it only to fire stones at wild animals endangering his flock. A stone was placed in the sling before the 2 ends were whirled above the head at great speed. When one end was released, the stone flew toward its target with devastating impact. Out of the Philistine camp emerged a terrifying figure. He was at least 9 feet or 3 meters tall, with legs like tree trunks and fists like hams. He was called Goliath and came from Gath. He wore a massive bronze helmet and a heavy suit of armor. A huge javelin was slung on his back, while he clasped an iron-clad spear. He bellowed across the valley, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Choose one man to come and fight with me. King Saul, I dare you. If he is able to kill me, the Philistines will become your servants. But if I kill him, then you will become our slaves." King Saul and the Israelites listened in horror. Who could take on the Philistine giant? For 40 days, Goliath appeared each morning and each evening and repeated his challenge. One morning, David arrived in the Israelites' camp bringing food for his brothers who were soldiers with King Saul. He saw Goliath for the first time and heard his words. "Who is this monster who dares to threaten the army of the Lord?" he asked. The Israelite soldiers told him about Goliath. David went to the king and said that he would take up the giant's challenge. "You can't fight this Philistine brute," smiled King Saul. "But I am the keeper of my father's sheep, and I am used to protecting them," David protested. Saul reluctantly agreed. "Go, and the Lord be with you," he said. He gave David his own tunic, a coat of armor, a bronze helmet, and a sword. David tried on his unfamiliar finery, but then shook his head and took it all off. He ran down to the valley and chose 5 smooth stones from the stream. He put them in his leather pouch and moved toward the giant. Goliath could not believe his eyes. "What's this? I ask for a man and they send a shrimp?" David replied, "You come against me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. I am not scared of you." And with that he fished the largest stone out of his pouch and put it in his sling. He whirled it around and let the stone fly. It sped through the air and reached its target, sinking into Goliath's forehead. The giant screamed and crashed to the ground. David ran to him, took his sword, and cut off his head. Triumphantly he lifted it high in the air. The Philistines fled in terror. The Israelites pursued them, hacking them down as they went. Then they turned to plunder the Philistines' camp. Understanding the story. Ancient battles were sometimes decided by one-on-one combat. Each side would choose a champion to represent them. The outcome was seen as being the will of the gods. Saul is scared of the champion Goliath, but the new leader David is fearless because he has complete trust in God. With only a sling for a weapon, David defeats the giant, proving that God protects those who keep faith in him.
Saul turns against David. After David had killed the Philistine giant, Goliath, he was invited to live with King Saul in Gibeah. It was very different from the life he had been used to as a humble shepherd boy in the fields around Bethlehem.
From the very first day, he and Saul's son, Jonathan, were inseparable. Jonathan loved David and shared everything with him, giving him his finest clothes as well as his sword and bow. And Saul, seeing how close the two young men were, made David an officer in the army, just like Jonathan. He gave him command of more than 1,000 men, and David led them on the battlefield with great success. And in time, Saul's daughter, Michal, fell in love with David and they were married. David's fame spread throughout Israel and Judah. His triumph over Goliath was the stuff of legends and would never be forgotten. Women sang and danced to the music of their tambourines and lutes and cymbals. Saul has slain his thousands, they chanted, and David has slain his tens of thousands. Although Saul had grown fond of David and knew how highly regarded he was, his heart sank and his stomach tied itself in knots when he heard these words. They say that David has killed tens of thousands, but that I, their king, have only slain thousands, he said to himself. That young man will be after my kingdom next. And, in his heart, Saul despaired because he knew that the Lord, who had chosen him so long ago, had now deserted him. He did not understand why. All his years as king, and as the battles he had fought seemed to stand for nothing. He was afraid of David and knew that the Lord was with him. He kept a jealous and wary eye on his young son-in-law. One day David was playing his harp, filling the air with sweet and soothing music. Saul listened, his eyes heavy, almost dropping off to sleep. But suddenly, as if possessed, he leapt to his feet. The hatred that had quietly gnawed away at him for so long erupted like a volcano. He seized a spear and hurled it at David's head. It missed by a hair's breadth and sank deep into the wall. David looked at Saul, stunned and unable to move. Incensed, Saul grabbed another spear and tried again, but this time David was prepared and dodged nimbly aside, then ran away as fast as he could. He reached his house and told his wife, Michal, what had happened. She seized her husband tightly and cried, "You must escape while you can. You must not stay here another moment. They will find you here and you will not stand a chance." And, when night had fallen, she lowered David out of the window on a rope and he fled into the darkness. Then she found a life-size statue and put it in David's bed. She arranged goat's hair on its head and drew the covers up over it so that it looked just like a man fast asleep. Saul's men arrived at the crack of dawn the next morning. They hammered on the door, asking for David. Michal let them in and whispered, "He is ill in bed. Please do not disturb him." They pushed her aside and crept up the stairs, opened the bedroom door, and tiptoed silently toward the bed. They pounced, swords at the ready, and pulled the covers off, only to discover that they had been tricked by a statue and a handful of goat's hair. By then, David was far away from Gibeah. He had gone straight to the prophet Samuel at his home in Ramah and told him the whole story. Jewish harp. David's harp playing helped to soothe Saul. Ancient versions of the harp were made of animal skin stretched over a sound box with strings attached to the frame. In his heart, Saul despaired because he knew that the Lord who had chosen him so long ago had now deserted him. Understanding the story. Saul cannot cope with God's rejection. He becomes tormented by jealousy and believes David is going to take his throne. In a fit of rage, he attacks David, who escapes to safety because God is on his side. Saul tries repeatedly to kill David, but finds it is not possible to defy God's will. Rosh Chodesh. The Jewish calendar was a lunar calendar, so the new moon festival called Rosh Chodesh was a time to celebrate the start of the month. Work came to a halt, offerings were made, and trumpets were blown during the festival. David the outlaw. David had fled from King Saul and taken refuge with the prophet Samuel at Ramah. He knew that Saul was determined to kill him and that his life hung by a thread. One night he left Samuel and went secretly back to Gibeah to talk to Jonathan, his great friend and the king's son. "What have I done?" he asked. "What is my crime? How have I wronged your father, and why does he want to kill me?" "You are not going to die," said his friend. "I would know. My father tells me everything." "Your father knows how close we are. Would he tell you if he was going to kill me?" retorted David. Jonathan promised to do his best to find out what his father was thinking. He would find David and let him know, with a signal, whether King Saul still wanted to kill him. The two friends said goodbye, and David fled to the fields. It was the new moon festival the next day, and everybody came to the feast with King Saul. But when they sat down to eat, there was one empty place at the table. Saul looked at Jonathan but said nothing. The following day, when David had still not appeared, Saul asked Jonathan, "Where is David? Why has he not come to eat with us either yesterday or today?" Jonathan excused his friend, saying that David had gone home to Bethlehem to make a sacrifice with his family. Saul stood up and banged the table in fury. "You are on his side, aren't you? I am ashamed of you," he shouted. "You must go and find him. Bring him to me. He must die." Jonathan felt his blood boil. "Why should he die?" he protested. To warn David that his life is in danger, Jonathan fires an arrow into the air. "What has he done?" And he got up and stormed away from the table. The next morning, as they had arranged, Jonathan went to the remote field where David was hiding. He fired an arrow high in the air. It landed far away in the distance, way beyond the place where David had concealed himself. This was the signal. It meant that David's life was still in danger and that he must flee far away. David came out from his hiding place, and, sadly, the two young men embraced and wept. "Go in peace, for we have a sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord," said Jonathan. They both knew that they would never see each other again. Jonathan turned and went back to Gibeah. David set off in the other direction, heading for the hills far away by the salt sea. It was a long and difficult journey by foot through the desert. But just after he passed the oasis of En-Gedi, he saw the perfect place to hide, a cave, tucked neatly into the crags where the wild goats lived. Its entrance was concealed by big boulders, and it stretched back into the darkness. As time went by, men came to join David, and soon he had a band of 400 followers. When Saul heard that David was hiding in the desert of En-Gedi with a band of loyal men, he set off to hunt him down. He took 3,000 soldiers with him. He was determined not to let David get away again. As they neared the salt sea, Saul went inside a cave to shelter from the sun. It was the cave of Adullam, where David and his men were hiding. They watched Saul from the depths of the cave, where the darkness concealed them completely. David knew that his enemy had been delivered into his hands. He could creep up and kill him just like that. Instead, he tiptoed up to Saul and cut a corner of his robe. But he immediately felt stricken with guilt and said to his men, "The Lord forbade that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him." When Saul left the cave, David followed him and called out, "My lord the king." Saul turned in astonishment as David went to him, bowing low. "See, my lord," he said, "look at this. It is a corner of your robe. I just cut it off. I could easily have killed you at the same time, but I could not harm someone who has been anointed by the Lord." Saul looked at the scrap of material. He was overcome by shame. "You are more righteous than I am. I have treated you badly. May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king and that the kingdom of Israel will be yours." Hideouts. Many natural caves like this one could be found in En-Gedi landscape. These were ideal hideouts for David and his followers. The darkness gave them protection, while the viewpoint made it easy to see an enemy advancing. "I know that you will surely be king and that the kingdom of Israel will be yours." Understanding the story, Jonathan accepts that David will be Saul's successor because this is God's will. But Saul has lost his faith and refuses to accept David. Though David has the opportunity to kill Saul, he cannot, because Saul is God's anointed king. When Saul realizes that David has spared his life, he is overcome with guilt at his own behavior. He finally accepts the Lord's wishes and recognizes that David deserves to be king. Samuel. Samuel became a prophet after receiving messages from the Lord as a boy. Though he warned of the dangers of a ruling monarch, Samuel did as the Lord asked and anointed Saul and David the first two kings of Israel. He did not write the 2 books of Samuel, but they were named after him as recognition for his part in Israel's history. The death of Saul. The great prophet Samuel died and was buried at home in Ramah. All of Israel mourned, including King Saul. Mount Gilboa. Situated in northern Israel overlooking the valley of Jezreel, Mount Gilboa is more like a ridge than a mountain. It was the scene for the bloody battle between the Israelites and the Philistines. The area is steeped in biblical history but tarnished by tragedy, with Saul and his sons all dying here. He has not seen Samuel for many years, but in the past the prophet had guided him in everything he did. Now the Philistines were gathering their forces yet again to take on Israel. When he saw the might of the enemy, Saul was overcome with terror. He could not eat, and he prayed to the Lord for guidance, but there was no answer. In desperation, Saul longed to contact Samuel, but he had banished the people who might have been able to help him. The sorcerers and magicians had been expelled. Saul asked his attendants if anyone had secret powers to summon up the spirit of Samuel. "I think there is still an old witch who lives in Endor, not too far away," one replied. That night, when everyone was asleep, Saul disguised himself in a cloak of sackcloth. He took 2 of his men, and they set off for Endor. When they found the witch's shack, Saul knocked on the door. There was no reply, except for a sudden scream from a screech owl. They knocked again and waited, chilled to the bone. At last the door creaked open, and an old woman beckoned them in. A fire crackled in the hearth, and a black pot bubbled in the flames. Shivering with fear, Saul told her why he had come. She refused to help. "Surely you know what King Saul has done. He tried to get rid of us. He is scared of our powers. This must be a trap. Do you want to get me killed?" Saul reassured her. "As surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this." Reluctantly, the witch agreed to help and asked him who he was trying to get in touch with. Saul replied, "The great prophet Samuel, who died not long ago." She peered at him in the gloom and let out a piercing scream. "You have tricked me," she shrieked. "You are Saul, aren't you?" "Do not be afraid," said Saul. "What do you see?" She croaked, "I see a spirit coming up out of the ground. It is an old man with a white beard, and he is wearing a robe." Immediately Saul knew that it was Samuel. "I am in such distress," he cried. "The Philistines are gathering to fight again, and God has deserted me. I beg you to tell me what to do." Samuel answered, "Why do you consult me now that the Lord has turned away from you? He has given your kingdom to David because you were disobedient. He will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines. Tomorrow you and your sons will die." Saul collapses in fear in Saul and the Witch of Endor by Anglo-American painter Benjamin West, 1738 to 1820. When he heard these words, Saul collapsed in a heap on the ground, weak with fear. He had not eaten anything all day and all night. The old witch saw what a terrible state he was in. "Let me give you something to eat so that you can get your strength back." When the meal was ready, Saul and his men tucked in gratefully, and that same night, before the first light of dawn filled the sky, they set off to rejoin their army in the camp. The next day the massed ranks of Philistines attacked the Israelites on Mount Gilboa, above the valley at Jezreel. It was a decisive victory for them, and before long hundreds of Israelites lay dead. Hundreds more had fled for their lives. Saul's sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, were killed, and Saul himself was mortally wounded. He turned to his armor-bearer and asked him to finish him off. "Draw your sword and kill me," he pleaded. "Do not leave it to those Philistine brutes." But the armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it, dying just as Samuel had prophesied. After the battle, the Philistines cut off Saul's head and stripped him of his armor. Then they took his body, together with the bodies of his sons, and put them on display on the walls of their great fortress at Beth-shan for all to see. But when the people of Jabesh and Gilead heard, they went straight there and took the bodies away. Saul had saved them many years before, and this was the least they could do. Respectfully, they carried the bodies back home. They buried their bones under a tamarisk tree and fasted for 7 days. Understanding the story. Saul is completely hopeless and alone, and turns to a practice he had outlawed himself when he visits the Witch of Endor. Samuel's ghost predicts Saul's tragic ending the next day. All of Saul's bad and selfish decisions have taken him to this point. God is no longer on his side, and Samuel is no longer alive for him to turn to. Wounded and defeated, Saul kills himself on the battlefield, surrounded by bloodshed.